Welcome back to Deconstructing Directing. I'm Andrew Robler, the founder and archivist here. We are nearing the end of Act 2, Our Directing Identity. Scenes 1 through 4 looked at existential questions about who we are as directors and why we do what we do. Scene 5 explored our artistic taste, and now in Scene 6, we need to address an important and challenging topic: power. The conversation around the power of directors and other artistic leaders in the theater industry has been going on for some time, but it has been at the forefront since 2017 when the Me Too movement was brought back into the spotlight and kept there in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder in 2020. The conversation has centered around the inevitable power dynamics that exist in the rehearsal and production process across all types of theater, both upstream and downstream. The increased focus on these power dynamics, especially in the context of vulnerable emotional and physical labor undertaken as part of live theater, has led to quite a few directors and artistic directors of major upstream theaters across the country being publicly fired over their abusive behavior. This has clearly happened at many downstream theaters as well, but the news is less national and thus harder to keep track of. Unfortunately, there are still many theaters that protect those in power for a variety of reasons, some of which we'll explore in this scene. In the context of discussing abusive behavior by those in positions of power, power can feel like a dirty word. I think many people's first reaction, including mine, is to want to dismantle or distance ourselves from power. We don't want to be accused of abusing power, so what better way to avoid that than to try and avoid power altogether? Unfortunately, trying to run from power as a director is a bit like trying to run from our shadow. It is something that is attached to us because of the environment we are in and the role we are taking on. So in this scene, we're going to define different types of power, discuss how we can work to minimize negative power dynamics, and also how we can leverage power to benefit our entire team. So let's start by defining power. If you look up the word power in the dictionary, the first two definitions are related but different. You'll see one definition that talks about the ability to do something. This is the definition we might use when we say that we have the power to make our own decisions. And you'll see one definition that references our ability to influence people or situations. It's this second definition we're focusing on today. However, I think we can actually get more specific than that thanks to the work of two social psychologists in the 1950s and 60s. I should mention before we get into this that this next section is very terminology heavy, but I promise there's a reason for it and that we will bring it back around to apply it to our directing work. So hang in there with me. I'm also going to put it all on the screen if you're watching this on video. John French and Bertram Raven identified 6 bases of social power, which expands on the ability to influence others to bring about a change in belief, attitude, or behavior. They first defined 5 types of social power: coercive, reward, legitimate, referent, and expert, followed by a 6th that Raven added a few years later: informational. We're not going to get in the weeds on this, but I do want to explain what each of these mean, because often we find ourselves talking past one another because when we talk about power, there's so many different ways to view it. There's also a handout in the usual spot on our site that breaks these down. Coercive power is what might also be referred to as hard power, associated with phrases like might makes right. Coercive power uses a threat of force, be it physical, emotional, social, political, or economic, to drive compliance. Importantly, the target of the coercion does not need to recognize they are being coerced for coercion to occur. Coercive power can be impersonal, such as the threat of being fired and/or blacklisted from a theater company, or personal, such as the threat of disapproval from a source that is important to the target. Notably, the fear of coercion can be a type of coercive power in itself, even if the coercion is never enacted. If I know you have the power to fire me, it doesn't matter if you do it or even mention it. That coercive power will impact the way that I interact with you. Reward power is what it sounds like, the use of a reward to motivate behavior, whether positive, like a pizza party for the cast if the stage manager never has to ask them to clean up the dressing room, or negative, such as pay being docked for being late to rehearsal. This, too, can be impersonal or personal in nature. Legitimate power is based in an accepted hierarchy. This can be cultural, social, or designation-based. For example, culturally legitimate power might be a man being shown deference due to being male. Socially legitimate power might be a director being shown deference due to their role in the social construct of a production process, and designated legitimate power might be an assistant director being shown deference because someone else in power, in this case the director, has given them authority. Referent power is a description of when we use personal connections or similarities to influence others. Flattery, relationship status, and inclusion in or exclusion from a social group or organization are all tools of referent power. It relies on the reputation of the power holder and often takes longer than other types of power to develop. Expert power is also pretty much exactly what it sounds like. Expert power is founded in expertise, knowledge, special skills, or talents. However, it's important to recognize that it's the perception of this expertise that matters to expert power, regardless of whether the person in power actually possesses it. Finally, informational power looks similar to expert power in that it is related to the exchange of information, but rather than being about innate or learned knowledge or skills, it has to do with the control of an informational source that others need or want. I provided some examples, but I'm willing to bet that just in reading or hearing these descriptions, you can start to identify the different ways in which power has been expressed throughout your life. Perhaps some that you've used yourself and some that you recognize were used by others. The thing about power is that it has to exist for a society or group to function. At least one person must have the ability to influence others in some way, shape, or form, or the group will not be able to work together. Power itself isn't morally bad or wrong. Some of the most pacifist figures throughout history relied on their own power to spread their message. We also know that with great power comes great responsibility, suggesting that power can be wielded for the betterment of others. Yet, we have also likely heard that power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. How can both things be true? In their PhD dissertation published in 2020, Tyler Burns-Saby asks this exact question and reaches an interesting conclusion. Saby suggests that how the person with power perceives the origin of that power is a factor. The person with power might see it as coming from within, an innate right that they have to that power. Tying this back to our 6 bases of power, this might align with expert or referent power, or perhaps even some types of legitimate power, like in a monarchy. Or they might see it as something that is given to them from outside themselves, like legitimate power based in a social construct, or expert power based in skills they've had the resources to develop while others may not. Similarly, Saby suggests that the direction of the responsibility felt with a person in power has an impact as well. If their sense of responsibility is primarily towards themselves, they are more likely to act in their self-interest. Whereas if their sense of responsibility is primarily toward others, they are more likely to act in the interests of others. Whew, okay, that's a lot of heady philosophical conversation, so let's ground it and apply it to our work as directors. There are 3 key lessons I think we can take away from this discussion about power to help us minimize the negative impact of our power in a production process. Note that I say minimize because we can never fully eliminate the potential for negative impacts as long as we have power. First, we need to understand that the fear of coercive power is not our fault, but it is our responsibility to address. The reality is that as directors, we are gatekeepers. We often choose our production team members, we almost always choose our actors, and sometimes we choose the show we want to direct. This means that we are a gatekeeper, and no matter how benevolent of a gatekeeper we are, we still hold the power to allow someone to work on a project or not. Because of this, along with the unfortunate history of directors abusing this power, we theoretically hold the power to speak negatively to other directors and producers about an artist, impacting their ability to work elsewhere in the industry. Theater artists know this, and they've all heard horror stories about it, so it doesn't matter if we're the kindest director in existence. The artists we've worked with almost all carry that baggage with them, and it predisposes many of them to agreeing with us so that they will stay in our good graces. This is why, in the aftermath of the Me Too movement, the role of intimacy directors became codified and implemented across the industry. Because we, as directors, hold power, even asking a genuine question about an actor's comfort level with something on stage like intimacy carries with it the risk that they will say okay simply because they don't want to risk us cutting off their access to the work they love to do. Now, this can be incredibly challenging to hear, and I know that because it was for me. When intimacy directors started to become a more prevalent part of the industry, I honestly felt insulted and demeaned. I felt like I created a safe space for my actors. I constantly reassured them and reminded them that they could say no at any time. I made sure that they had opportunities to speak their mind, and I never penalized anyone for saying that they were uncomfortable. What began to shift my thinking was the realization that every rehearsal room and production is connected. It's very rare that artists work only with one theater for the entirety of their career, which means that the lessons they learn in one production are carried with them, and that includes lessons about power and gatekeeping. It didn't matter how kind or open I was working with artists who had many, sometimes dozens of experiences working with people who in most cases weren't aware of or concerned about their power dynamic in the room. And this doesn't just apply to intimacy. I've had actors break down in tears during rehearsal because I used phrasing or asked a question that reminded them of abusive or negative experiences they had had with other directors before me. We have to accept that it's not just about us and put structures in place to make it crystal clear to those we are working with that we are serious about minimizing the negative effects and uses of our power. Which is a perfect segue to the next lesson. We need to voluntarily place a check on our own power. If actors are concerned about coercion or negative rewards, who can they talk to about us? In many environments, that answer is the other artists in the production or their friends and family. This often leads to resentment building among some or all of the company, negatively impacting our ability to effectively lead. Another way to look at it is that when we don't check our own power and the potential for its abuse, those who have learned to fear that abuse will work to find their own power, often through the referent power of social dynamics, like creating a toxic group chat, for example. So how do we check our power? Well, by providing a clear avenue for concerns to be expressed, not to us directly, but to someone who is empowered to advocate on behalf of those bringing the concern forward. If we aren't the producer, often this person is the producer. But if we are perceived as being too close to the producer, remember that idea of like designated legitimate power, then this may not be effective enough. One of the things I've started doing in recent years is asking a colleague who is not someone I'm known to be very close with if they will serve as a sounding board for any of my company members who may have concerns about my leadership and use of my power. Now, the reality is that this avenue has never been exercised by anyone in a production I've directed, but having the option is a clear signal that I recognize the power dynamic and have chosen to voluntarily try to limit my own power. If you'd like an example of the language I use to ask a colleague to fill that role and to communicate the option to my cast, there's a handout in the usual spot. There are likely other ways we can place clear limits on our own power. This is just the one I've found to be most helpful. The final lesson we can take from our exploration of power is that because of the connectedness of production processes and rehearsal rooms, we need to be very careful about using harder power, especially when it is punitive. For example, I will never, again, even joke about charging my cast money if they just leave a script in the theater or fining them for being late. While these are punishments many of us may have experienced in our own development as theater artists, I do not find them to be effective and only serve to reinforce negative perceptions of how I use my power as a director. Now, to be clear, this is different than a natural consequence. If an actor loses their script, they will have to pay to buy a new one. If a prop breaks because someone was playing with it when they shouldn't have been, especially after being told not to, then they may be responsible for helping to replace it. But coercive power and negative reward power like fines and threats, even in jest, only serve to reinforce the traditional power dynamic that has led to so much harm throughout the industry. And they are signals to our teams that we may be the kind of people that will use the power we have to harm them if we feel threatened. I recognize that this can be difficult to hear, and I want to be clear in saying that I don't think those who use those tactics, even in jest, are necessarily bad people or bad directors. We are often simply using the tools that we have seen used by others. We don't enjoy having to use those tactics, we just often don't know what else to do. We'll talk more about this in the final scene in this act, about navigating our own emotional regulation as directors. But let's close out this scene with a look at how we can leverage the power we have to benefit our entire team and end on a positive note. Like we discussed above, power itself is not inherently negative. Several types of power, including expert power, referent power, and legitimate power, especially when based in voluntary social structures like a theatrical production, can be wonderful tools to drive positive outcomes for an entire group of people. Thinking back to the first act when we explored the flame paradigm for directing, in our discussion about the director as facilitator, we talked about the danger of assumptions in theater and conversely, the importance of specificity. I find that specificity in the context of a power dynamic like ours is a lot like an ice cube in a hot beverage. Without it, we are far more likely to get burned, though it's possible to avoid that if we are extra careful. But when we can be specific about power, it makes it easier to navigate with less risk of harm. Now, there will be those purists who are unhappy about watering down the process with this specificity, but when I weigh the risk of harm against the small inconvenience for me as a director, it's an easy choice. So let's look at 3 ways we can use our specificity to help ensure our power is more beneficial than harmful to our teams. First, we can explicitly and specifically acknowledge the power dynamic up front. Imagine for a moment coming into a rehearsal process, or any workplace really, and hearing the person in power acknowledge that dynamic. Might sound something like this. I want to take a moment and acknowledge the power dynamic in this room. As the director, I was responsible for asking each of you to be part of this project. You auditioned or applied and may not have known much about me during that process, even though we asked you to share a lot about who you are and show up in a vulnerable way during auditions, callbacks, or interviews. As such, the default dynamic in this room is that I was the gatekeeper for this process. And that can bring with it concern about what happens if I get upset by something you say or do. We've all heard the horror stories about directors who fire or maybe even blacklist artists they don't like. I've been on the receiving end of that behavior before as an actor. I can't change that power dynamic. The reality is that I am ultimately responsible for the production. But what I want to say up front is that I am working hard to be the kind of director that you don't have to worry will behave that way. And I have a few processes and safeguards I put in place to try and reassure you of that, since actions matter so much more than words. How would that make you feel? I know I would be instantly more willing to trust that director, though I would be looking for their behavior throughout the process to back up that initial statement. Over the past 10 years that I've been building this approach, I've heard from pretty much every single member of my production teams that they found it reassuring and meaningful to hear. It's important to remember that this needs to be made up of I statements, much like telling someone, don't think about a pink elephant, at which point a pink elephant is the first thing that pops up to their mind. There's a reason to be concerned about a discussion of what you don't want to occur. But the difference here is that I am talking about myself, not others. Because a statement like this is focused on ourselves as directors and is addressing a systemic issue, it is far preferable to be specific than to rely on assumptions. There's a worksheet below to help you form your own power dynamic acknowledgement, along with the example above in written form. So the first approach is acknowledging the ways in which we don't want our power to impact our process. The second is to be specific about the ways in which we do want to use our power. This is where we can bring together a lot of the topics we've been talking about through Act 2, including our why, our lived experience, our artistic taste, and even addressing our role models and imposter syndrome if we feel that that's important. To be clear, I'm not advocating that a director stand up and tell everyone that they're super nervous and have no idea what they're doing. That's counterproductive for everyone involved. In fact, I would argue that the order in which you share the above information matters. So here's an example. All right, now that we've talked about how I want to avoid this power dynamic being abused, I want to share a bit more about why I'm asking for your trust in this process. To start, I want to talk about the reason that I've stepped into this role. To me, there is nothing more exciting and wonderful than watching the people around me realize their full potential. And I am a director because I love being in a position to make that happen. Artistically, this means that I care most about the relationships within the story we are telling, along with our collective relationship with our audience. And I see my role as being able to step back and see the big picture of how all those relationships come together. I've worked with a lot of directors over the years as an actor, and I've learned that the ones I have valued the most are the ones that see each person in the process as a collaborator and not as a subordinate, which is what I try to do. That said, I think many of us in the arts worry about being discovered as an imposter at times, and for me, part of addressing that imposter syndrome is being willing and able to admit that I don't know everything. And so I look forward to learning from you and alongside you, as well as sharing my own perspective with you through this process. If you've been following Act 1 and Act 2 content in order, then you may recognize that in some ways this is an extension of the About the Director document we discussed in Act 1, Scene 2, Facilitation. In fact, this is something you could absolutely incorporate into that document, especially if you feel nervous or worried about finding the words to share it verbally. If you haven't watched that scene yet or want to review it, I'll link it below, and the worksheet I mentioned will be included in the usual place below this scene as well. The final approach we can take to use our power for good is to use our power of designation effectively. Thinking back to the 6 types of power we explored in this scene, one of the types of legitimate power is designated, meaning it is power that someone else with power has given to someone else. In a production process, we designate power to others regularly, be it stage managers, assistant directors, choreographers, and even asking actors to lead others in warm-ups. When we designate power in this way, we can take extra steps to be specific and clear with those we designate about the power dynamics they are stepping into. For instance, whenever I work with a new stage manager or assistant director, I have clear conversations with them about the way that I approach power dynamics, as well as the ways in which I don't like seeing power used in that environment. This might include sharing that I'm not okay with yelling except in safety situations, discussing my concerns about punitive or coercive measures like fining actors, and having a conversation about how we will support each other in our emotional self-regulation so that we don't allow our own stresses to bleed into abuses of power. These conversations are often ones that I have in private with those I am designating power to initially, but my goal is often to be able to share with the whole company that we have had those conversations and are on the same page about our approach to our power within the company. There's a worksheet below that will help you outline how you want to have conversations like this. So there you have it, a primer on making peace with power. I hope this was a helpful, if perhaps a bit densely packed, discussion. Please remember that just like all of our material, it's not going anywhere, and you are welcome to come back and watch, listen to, or read any or all of it again if it's helpful. My hope is that this gives you food for thought about your own relationship with and approach to power as a director and a leader. If you're not a Patreon member and want to be, you can earn fun perks like stickers, monthly hangouts, and Q&A sessions with me, and more for helping to support this project financially. But none of this content will ever live behind a paywall, so if you can't or don't want to join the Patreon, don't worry. You'll still get all of Deconstructing Directing completely free. All right, I'll see you again when you're ready to dive into Act 2, Scene 7, Taking Care of Ourselves. Until then, my fellow storytellers, I challenge us all to be recklessly kind.